There is a peculiar comfort in discovering that one's story is not yet finished. In a world so eager to label and finalize, the idea that our narratives are still being written is profoundly liberating. One need only look to the Bible to see this sacred pattern: lives transformed, destinies rewritten, failures redeemed not by human will, but by divine intervention. God is the great author, and he never puts down his pen. Consider Abraham, an old man with no heir, resigned to the shadows of obscurity, but the voice of God called him out of his tent, into the stars, into a promise. His story did not end in barrenness. It began there. Or take Moses, a fugitive with blood on his hands and a stammer on his tongue. When God entered his wilderness, he became a deliverer. What man had written off as disqualified, God requalified. It is tempting to believe that one's past is too heavy, that the ink is too dark to be rewritten. But Scripture insists otherwise. David was a shepherd, forgotten by his own father, but in God's narrative, he was king. Ruth was a widow from a foreign land, yet God wove her into the lineage of the Messiah. Even Jonah, fleeing in the opposite direction, was rerouted by grace. What all these stories share is not a human resolve, but a divine interruption. There is a strange mercy in the way God works. He does not discard what is broken. He does not delete the shameful chapters. He redeems them. What is offered in weakness, he uses in strength. What is surrendered in humility, he lifts in glory. The prodigal son is not punished, but embraced. The thief on the cross is not condemned, but welcomed. Such reversals are the hallmark of God's storytelling. The Bible does not present perfect characters. It presents real ones, and in every flawed figure, there is the breath of divine possibility. What man calls the end, God calls the beginning. What looks like defeat is often a preparation. Trials become testimonies, and ashes become beauty. But this requires surrender. The quill must be handed over. The illusion of control must be yielded, for only the author knows the ending, and only he can thread the meaning through the chaos. Perhaps you feel as if your story is too tangled to be restored. Perhaps regret echoes louder than hope. Yet it is precisely into such places that God writes his most astonishing chapters, not by editing the past, but by transforming it. Joseph, betrayed and imprisoned, did not rise in spite of his suffering, but because of it. The pit led to the palace. The cross led to the resurrection. The stone was not the end, but the hinge of eternity. Let no one deceive you into believing that your value is determined by your history. In the hands of God, history is the canvas upon which grace is painted. He does not require a noble beginning. He does not require clean pages. Only willingness, only trust, only the courage to believe that when God steps into your story, it does not remain yours alone. It becomes a testimony not of who you were, but of who he is. The Bible is not merely a record of ancient lives. It is a mirror and a map, a mirror that shows us the raw material of human frailty, a map that points to the possibility of redemption. And the same voice that called Lazarus from the grave now calls to every soul suffocating under the weight of finality. Come forth, begin again. The author is still writing. God's redemptive power transforms broken beginnings into divine purposes. God's redemptive power transforms broken beginnings into divine purposes. Throughout the Bible, one finds a consistent theme of reversal, not by human effort, but by divine intervention. This is not simply the improvement of one's circumstances, but the complete redefinition of identity and purpose. From Genesis to Revelation, the narrative is filled with individuals who began in weakness, shame, or obscurity, and were raised to positions of profound spiritual and historical significance. The story of Abraham, for example, begins with a man advanced in years, childless and without inheritance. In the ancient world, this was not only a personal sorrow, but a societal mark of incompleteness. Yet God calls him into a covenant, promises him descendants as numerous as the stars, and makes him the father of many nations. His broken beginning becomes the foundation of a covenantal people, not because of his own merit, but because of divine promise. Likewise, consider the story of Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. He seemed utterly forgotten by both man and God. His beginnings were laced with injustice and abandonment, yet God's redemptive thread weaves even through betrayal and prison bars. Joseph rises not only to power but to purpose, becoming the very instrument through which a famine-stricken world finds life. His suffering is not erased but transformed into the means by which others are saved. It is through the very wound of betrayal that healing comes. This is the rhythm of divine redemption. What others meant for evil, God meant for good. The life of David offers another lens into how God transforms unlikely beginnings. A young shepherd, disregarded even by his own family, David is anointed in secrecy while his brothers are passed over. In human terms, he is unqualified, but divine calling does not conform to human hierarchies. God sees in David a heart after his own, and though his path to kingship is fraught with exile, danger, and moral failure, it is precisely within those valleys that God forges him into a man who would lead a nation and write songs that still resonate centuries later. David's story reveals that God does not require perfection to begin his work. He begins with the rejected, the fragile, the forgotten. In the New Testament, the pattern continues with individuals like Peter, who begins as an impulsive fisherman and ends as a foundational figure in the early church. His betrayal of Christ is among the most painful in the gospel story, and yet it is not the end. Christ restores him not with shame, but with a call, "Feed my sheep." The same mouth that denied becomes the mouth that preaches Pentecost. The redemptive power of God does not erase the past, but reorients it. What was once a mark of failure becomes a mark of transformation. This principle is perhaps most powerfully demonstrated in the person of Paul, formerly known as Saul, a persecutor of Christians. His beginning is filled with violence and misguided zeal. Yet on the road to Damascus, his story is intercepted. Not only is he forgiven, he is commissioned. He becomes the author of much of the New Testament, not because his past was clean, but because God's grace is sufficient. His letters do not shy away from his past, but instead illuminate how God's power is made perfect in weakness. The one who once destroyed the church now builds it, teaches it, nurtures it. Such is the inversion that occurs when divine grace meets human brokenness in every generation and every narrative thread. The Bible reveals that God delights in beginning where others would end. The overlooked, the broken, the outcast, these are not disqualified, they are often chosen. Their lives become testimonies not to their strength, but to the author who rewrites even the most shattered stories. In this redemptive pattern, one finds hope not only for biblical characters, but for oneself. Surrendering control allows God to rewrite our story through grace. Surrendering control allows God to rewrite our story through grace. The human instinct is to cling tightly to plans, to shape identity and direction through effort, logic, and will. Yet Scripture repeatedly points to the paradox that in losing one's grip, one gains something greater. The act of surrender is not a sign of weakness, but the beginning of a divine partnership. It is not passivity, but a conscious yielding to the wisdom of one far greater. The very foundation of faith is built upon the understanding that God knows more than we do, sees farther than we can, and desires good for us beyond what we dare hope. It is in letting go of our need to orchestrate every outcome that we finally make room for God's redemptive power to work freely within us. The story of Mary, the mother of Jesus, is a profound example of this surrender. A young girl, engaged and planning an ordinary life, is suddenly approached by the divine with an impossible request to bear the Messiah. Her response is not one of negotiation or resistance, but of trust. "Be it unto me according to your word," she says. In that moment of surrender, history changes. Her willingness to yield opens the door for salvation to enter the world. It is not her status, her preparation, or her plans that qualify her. It is her surrender that marks her as chosen. Through her life, we glimpse the mysterious strength found in releasing control. Another image comes through the story of the disciples. When Jesus calls Peter and Andrew, James and John, they are fishermen going about their daily routines. He does not first explain the journey ahead. He simply says, "Follow me," and they leave their nets. The nets are not just tools. They represent livelihood, identity, security. Yet to follow Christ is to release them. Only in doing so are they able to step into their true purpose. Their journey with Jesus is marked by uncertainty, failure, and moments of doubt. But it is also through these same surrendered moments that they are formed into apostles. They do not rise by clinging to what they know, but by walking into what they cannot yet understand, guided only by trust in the one they follow. Surrender is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a long obedience in the same direction, a quiet acceptance of obscurity, a repeated choosing of trust when the road feels uncertain. It can mean accepting the pruning of dreams we once held tightly, knowing that what is being cut away may be preparing us for a greater fruitfulness. It can mean continuing in prayer, even when silence seems to follow. The Garden of Gethsemane offers one of the most intimate portrayals of surrender in all of Scripture. Jesus himself, facing the agony of the cross, pleads for another way, yet submits to the Father's will. In that sacred moment, surrender is not a denial of anguish, but a victory over fear. And in that surrender, redemption for all humanity begins to unfold. What the world calls control is often an illusion. We plan and strategize, but cannot predict what lies around the bend. The surrendered life is not a rejection of wisdom, but a refusal to place ultimate trust in ourselves. It acknowledges that we are not the center of the story, but beloved characters in a narrative guided by divine hands. The beauty of grace is that it does not force its way in. It waits for the door of the heart to be opened, and once it enters, it does not coerce, it transforms. Surrender allows grace to move past the walls we build, past the defenses we maintain, and begin a rewriting of our story that is far richer than what we would have scripted for ourselves, even in moments when surrender feels like loss. The biblical witness assures us it is never in vain. The act of laying down one's own will becomes the fertile soil for divine purpose to grow. What feels like death to self often becomes life in abundance. The Apostle Paul writes of being crucified with Christ, so that it is no longer he who lives, but Christ in him. This is not a poetic metaphor alone. It is a spiritual reality that comes through surrender. The old story ends not in defeat, but in transformation. The Bible reveals that no past is too damaged for God's restoration. The Bible reveals that no past is too damaged for God's restoration. Time and again, the sacred pages testify not to the perfection of humanity, but to the persistence of divine mercy. What man views as failure, God sees as foundation. He does not look at the shattered past as wasted history, but as material for redemption. The entire narrative of Scripture is built on the reality that brokenness is not a barrier to God's work. In fact, it is often the very starting point. The beauty of God's character is not merely that he forgives, but that he restores. He takes what is marred, rejected, and ruined and reshapes it into something purposeful, even beautiful. This truth is not limited to select individuals in ancient times, but is written into the very nature of God's dealings with humanity. The woman at the well, whose history was riddled with rejection and relational failures, met Christ in the middle of her shame. Instead of condemnation, she received revelation. Her encounter at that well turned her into one of the first evangelists of the gospel. Her past did not disqualify her, it positioned her. Her story was not over. In fact, it was just beginning, and it began in the place of her deepest pain. This is not an exception, but a pattern. God is not embarrassed by the wreckage. He is moved with compassion. His grace is not cautious, but bold, stepping right into the mess in order to redeem. The story of Rahab is another example. A prostitute in the city of Jericho, her identity was socially and morally scorned. Yet she made a single choice to trust the God of Israel, and that choice rewrote her legacy. She became part of the lineage of Jesus. Her name is listed in the genealogy of the Messiah, not as a footnote, but as a testament to how radically God's mercy can reframe a life. Her history was not ignored, but neither was it held against her. Through faith, her past was woven into God's redemptive plan. Even Peter, who walked closely with Jesus, denied him in his most critical hour. The weight of that betrayal was enough to sink any sense of worth. Yet, after the resurrection, Jesus sought him out personally. He did not cast Peter away or remind him of his failure. He reinstated him. He called him to feed his sheep, to shepherd his people, to be a pillar in the early church. That moment of denial, which could have marked the end, became the backdrop for grace. Peter's past was not erased, but transformed. It became a reminder of mercy rather than a monument of shame. One of the most dramatic transformations comes through the life of Paul. A persecutor of Christians, a man who stood by as innocent lives were taken, was met by Christ on the road to Damascus. His past was drenched in violence and misguided zeal. Yet that did not stop God from choosing him, redeeming him, and using him to shape the theology and spread of the early church. Paul's letters do not shy away from his past. Instead, they highlight it, not to glorify sin, but to magnify grace. His life shouts the truth that no one is beyond the reach of God's hand. The Bible does not veil the flaws of its heroes because it seeks not to exalt human virtue, but divine mercy. Every redeemed life within its pages serves as a beacon to those who believe they are too far gone. The broken, the ashamed, the forgotten, the guilty, all are welcomed, all are pursued, all are eligible for transformation. The qualifications are not perfection or pedigree, but openness to the one who makes all things new. God's ability to restore is not hindered by the severity of one's past. In fact, the greater the ruin, the greater the glory when restoration comes. The past is never too damaged for his touch. The deeper the crack, the brighter his light shines through.